So, to take an example, you'll recall in cultural relativism, right? The argument for it began with differences among cultures on right and wrong and their opinions on right and wrong. Um, the argument for subjectivism does a similar sort of argument, but instead of noting differences culture to culture, it notices differences from person to person. So one example of these differences is on the issue of homosexuality. So we've seen a great deal of change on this issue over the years. That there was a point in the past where homosexuality was illegal, and a majority of people thought that it was moral, often on religious grounds. And even as recently as 2001, a majority of Americans considered homosexuality to be wrong, and only 40% considered them to be morally acceptable. This has changed a great deal. By 2017, we have 63% who see homosexuality as morally acceptable and 33% who see it as wrong. But nonetheless, that's a fair amount of disagreement, right? We're talking about millions of people here. So we even see this in the political realm. Right in 2001, there was a pride parade in which every single Democratic and Republican politician in the state showed up, at least implicitly, um, providing their support for the cause of homosexual rights. But then on the other side, as recently as 2017, Mike Pence made a that was sort of maybe coded and implicit, but he said, traditional or heterosexual marriage was the backbone of society, and without it, society would collapse. We'll see differences here on the morality of among many other issues. So what conclusion should we draw from this? We saw the argument for cultural relativism, which began with differences among cultures and concluded that there was no objective fact of the matter. And in fact, if you look from person to person, there's a wide variety of moral judgments. Right? So there are definitely differences in this respect as well. So subjectivists do a similar thing to cultural relativists, right? They take as a premise all these differences in people's moral judgments and conclude that there is no fact of the matter about whether things are morally right or wrong. There's only personal opinions about morality. So to get to sort of the origins of this view and make it a little more precise, we should look at David Hume, who's considered sort of the beginning point of subjectivism. Although, with everything in philosophy, there was some Greek philosopher or Persian or Chinese philosopher that said it earlier. But we like to start with Hume. He articulated it very precisely. So he argues that morality is a matter of what he calls sentiment, which we might call emotion, um, rather than reason. So there's the facts in the world, right, that can be true and false, right, that are objective. So there's a fact that some people are gay, right, and some people are straight. But what David Hume says is there are no facts about whether it's right or wrong. Rightness and wrongness don't exist out there in the world. Um, there are only feelings that people have about these facts. So for Hume, when we make a moral judgment about something, be it someone's sexuality or helping the poor or murder, we're simply expressing our feelings about those things. A lot of murder makes me feel bad, right? Then I say murder is bad. There's nothing in the world. Murder is not objectively bad. Things I have about murder. Similarly, if I think about helping the poor, it makes me feel good, or I see someone help the poor, it makes me feel good. The goodness is only in my feelings. It's not in the world. So if Hume is right, um, this is a radical reinterpretation of the way we talk about morality, right? We do say things like murder is wrong. If there's nothing in the world that makes that true, then strictly speaking, it would seem like that claim is false. It's not true that murder is wrong because wrongness does not exist outside of my feelings, right? So is that what we have to say is that all moral claims are false? Well, maybe that would be one approach, squaring Hume's right account of morality being based in the emotions with our moral claims, which appear to be about the world. Another way we can get around it is to reinterpret the moral judgments and say, look, when we say murder is wrong, we don't mean to be making some claim about the universe, about these facts. Instead, we're just expressing our approval or disapproval, and that's just the way we say it. often our language is imprecise, right? And is trying to reinterpret our language to fit philosophy. So on this account, which we call the linguistic turn, right, we're looking at our language about morality and kind of reinterpret it, what human thinks and what subjectivists think about metaphysical status of morality, right? It's something that doesn't exist in the world. So in this view, if someone says homosexuality is wrong, they're not trying to say anything about the world. They're not trying to express, right, a fact. Instead, they're effectively saying homosexuality boo, right? Or something like I disapprove of homosexuality, right? They're expressing a feeling. And so on this view, the same thing applies to all moral judgments. To help people, again, I'm not saying it's objectively good or goodness exists in the world. I'm just saying I like it when people are murder is wrong. I just mean I don't like murder, right? Um, let's call that simple subjectivism. Right? One form of subjectivism. Moral judgments simply express the speaker's approval or disapproval of something in the world. One serious problem for simple subjectivism, however, is that it seems to entail that there's never actually any disagreement over moral issues, right? So again, let's interpret our language about, let's use the homosexuality example, um, using this linguistic turn, right? This way of reinterpreting our language to fit sort of metaphysics of morals. Someone says homosexuality is wrong, and someone else says, no, it's right. What they really mean to be saying is one person means to say, I do not approve of homosexuality, and the other person means to be saying, I approve of homosexuality. Well, those are actually not contradictory claims, right? Both of those can be true at the same time. I can say I approve, you can say you disapprove. We're not actually disagreeing, right? Um, simple subjectivism seems to entail that moral disagreement is impossible, right? And that sort of seems absurd, right? We're the sort of heated disagreements that people get into over morality and how serious they seem to take the stakes seems to reveal, right, in our beliefs that we're actually talking about some fact in the world. Right? For example, if we think something's wrong, then we think it ought to be stopped and so on. If we're walking around saying, oh, I like that, and the other person's saying, oh, I don't like that, we might as well be disagreeing over art or like onions, right? But moral disagreements seem to be more serious than that. How can we square that with this linguistic turn and this reinterpretation of our language? Well, there's another approach, another kind of subjectivism, motivism, which still is reinterpreting our language, but in a sort of even more radical sense. So what emotivism says is moral judgments are not statements of fact at all. Now, for simple subjectivism, when I say I approve of murder, I'm still making an factual statement. It happens to be a statement about my own mind, right, about what I approve or disapprove of, but that's still sort of the kind of claim that can be true or false, and it's speaking about a part of the world, even though it's in my head, right? Emotivism is even more radical. It's saying that murder is wrong is not even expressing, not even attempting to say something that is true, right? It's not like saying grass is green or the acceleration of gravity is 9.81 meters per second squared. And instead, it's saying something like, um, well, it's something else, another one of these things that we do with language. So, for example, um, some of the things we do with language besides state facts are make commands. You know, I say close the door. That's not trying to say something about the world, the way the world is. In fact, it's an attempt to make the world. Either way, it's not true or false. Right? If I say close the door, you wouldn't say false. It doesn't make sense. Similarly, I might say, right, if I hurt myself. That's not a statement about the world. I'm not trying to describe the world. That kind of reflects how I feel, right? They're just not the sorts of statements that can be true or false. So what emotivism claims is that moral statements are like this. They're not the kinds of statements that can be true or false. They're not even attempting to describe the world. They're not even attempting to describe my own approval or disapproval. Instead, they're just sort of expressions of feelings or perhaps attempts to influence people's behavior, right? So for emotivism, if I said homosexuality is wrong, what I really mean to say is yuck, homosexuality, ugh, just express a feeling, or I'd be saying, you don't be gay, right? Or something like that. It's not expressing a fact, doing something else with language. That's emotivism. So we should see if emotivism passes the moral disagreement test. Right? We saw that simple subjectivism uh, ends up making it so you can't disagree over moral issues, and it seems like people really do disagree very vehemently. So what about emotivism? Well, it doesn't allow for a kind of disagreement where people are sort of have contradictory beliefs, right? So it wouldn't be the kind of disagreement where one person says round and the other person says the earth is flat. But emotivism does allow for a kind of what they call disagreement in attitude, right? So it's like a contradictory desire for the world to be a certain way. Somebody says homosexuality is wrong, they're sort of expressing a desire for people not to be gay. If somebody says homosexuality is okay, it's expressing a desire for people to be allowed to be gay. And so there's a disagreement on what they want the world to be like, even if strictly speaking, they're not contradicting each other, right, logically. So we call this disagreement in attitude, but maybe it's close enough to moral disagreement to capture, right, the sort of vehemence that we see in the world. Okay, well, that's the case. It's a fair amount of reinterpretation of our language. And maybe you find that plausible, but maybe you don't, right? And this is a problem with emotivism and with simple subjectivism. Um, is this really what we are doing in the English language? So if I say murder is wrong, am I really just talking about how I feel? Or am I really just saying, I hope you don't murder anyone? Or do I really actually express a belief about something that I think is true, actually true? Um, I guess that's up to you to interpret, what you think. But, for example, if someone tries to murder me, right? I would say, no, what they did is wrong. Like objectively, you shouldn't have done it, right? I would also like to make them try. But in addition, I think, making a factual claim, right? So for emotivism to work, they kind of have to say, you don't really know what you mean with your sentences, right? Maybe when you say murder is wrong, you think you're making a statement of fact, but you're actually mistaken about that. This is what we call an error theory. Right? So I can be wrong about things. I can have mistaken beliefs, and I can even sometimes be mistaken about maybe what I think I mean by a sentence. But um, when I start doubting whether anything I say, right, whether I have any insight into whether I believe what I'm saying, it starts to get tricky, right? You would think that I have some sort of idea of what's going on in my head and, what I'm trying to express with my language. And emotivists have to, right, use this error theory that says, no, no, you just talk a lot, but you don't really have any insight into, right, what you mean by your words. And you're actually mistaken about what you mean by your words when you're talking about morality. So those are two kinds of subjectivism, simple subjectivism, emotivism. They both got their problems, emotivism seems to solve some problems with simple subjectivism, but has its own problems with plausibility. But let's set those aside and talk about and step aside from the sort of the sidetrack about language and talk about the denial of value, right? Subjectivism was introduced as a claim about morality itself, what we mean by our moral statements. And what you get out of subjectivism is a form of nihilism about values, right? So it's a claim that values are not things that exist in nature. There are tables and chairs and planets, right? But rightness and wrongness do not exist in nature. They're only invented by the human brain. So according to the nihilist, nothing is actually wrong or right. And everyone finds that a little attractive when you're dealing with a moral dilemma that's very tricky, right? It can hands and be like, I don't know, there's just no fact of the matter. It's sort of up to, the eye of the beholder. But there are so many very clear cases where like we want to say, no, this is obviously a real and true thing, right? So, genocide is just bad, right? It doesn't seem like it would be a matter of opinion, right? It seems to be an absolute and objective truth, right? But to be a subjectivist, to deny, right, any objective truth about morality. And That's a claim you can swallow, right? If you think overall the subjectivist approach is more attractive, right? And you'd have to say, look, I know it sounds crazy, but there's really no fact of the matter even about whether genocide is bad. You can, any philosophical theory, you end up having to bite some kind of sort of, we call it biting the bullet when you say, here's my theory, I think it's consistent and good. There's some counterintuitive parts to it, but I'm going to insist that they're true, right? So, you can always bite the bullet at some point, but it seems like a tough one. It seems like we'd like to, condemn genocide as objectively false. And you just can't do that if you're subjectivist. Sorry, genocide is objectively wrong. In fact, if you think about it, in a philosophy class, you might say, yeah, I'm a nihilist about value. I don't think values exist. But if you watch the way people behave, right, it's kind of hard to think that they really believe it in their heart, right? So everyone at the very least seems to think it would be wrong to kill, me, right? Everyone thinks it would be wrong to kill them. And if you watch the way they behave, it does seem like they are actually trying to make moral judgments with their moral statements, not just emotions and things like that. So if you observe people's behavior, it really does seem like they do believe that moral values exist. But, it's open to nihilists to insist that, look, nihilist is true whether anyone believes it, right? The truth can be out there even if people don't believe it. There was a time when no one believed the earth is round. They were all wrong. One of the attractive things about subjectivism, it seems to match up with what science tells us, insofar as if science is our best guide to, what the world is like and what exists, um, moral values don't show up in any theories of physics, right, or chemistry or biology. Um, and so if values aren't described by our best sciences, right, if moral rightness and wrongness aren't described by the best science, then what reason do we have to think they exist, right? Science is our best guide to what exists. And there's something attractive about that view, but we do have to pause for a moment and realize that science is not the only arbiter of what exists. For example, mathematics, right? So mathematics is not an empirical inquiry; it's a separate thing from science, but it does, you might argue, tell us objective truths about what mathematical objects is like, right? So science may never, discover the location of the number three, but mathematics can tell us objective facts about it. Similarly, logic, right? So logic studies objective properties of rationality. And if morality is connected with rationality, then it's possible that there could be objective truths about morality that aren't the type studied by, biologists and physicists, right? They might be the types of truths studied by logicians. So we've already seen that moral judgments can be backed by reasons, right? So for example, here's a moral judgment. Jones is a bad man. You could you should, ask me, okay, well, what are your reasons for judging Jones to be bad? And then I can give you reasons. Oh, he's a habitual liar. He cheats at cards. He once killed a man over 27 cents, whatever. So I have my judgment and I have my reasons for the judgment. Now you could ask further questions. You might say, okay, you say he's a liar, but what's bad about being a liar? And I could give you some more reasons for why lying is bad. Um, my reasoning might ultimately bottom out somewhere, right? So it won't keep going forever. But maybe I'd end up saying something like, human society is impossible if everybody lies, something like that. Therefore, lying is bad. Um, so, in principle, your moral judgments can be backed logically with reasons, and of course, reasoning ends somewhere, but so does science. Someday we'll get to the basic particles. Go any further. Um, The point being, moral reasoning in principle is really no different from any other sort of reasoning. In mathematics, I could ask why every number has a successor, and there's no answer. That's a basic axiom. So the process of investigating, right, moral claims and giving reasons for moral claims is not so different from other supposedly objective inquiries in mathematics. So back to our example of homosexuality. I mean, people have tried to offer reasons for why they think homosexuality is wrong. There's a popular refrain in conservative circles that says, well, it's going to be harmful to children somehow. That claim appears to be false, as we can tell. There doesn't appear to be any harm to children by allowing homosexuality to exist. Other reasons people have given is that it's just an unnatural. Of course, that argument requires a definition of what unnatural means. In the statistical sense, there's a few ways you could define natural. If you define natural as sort of like statistically strange or outside the norm, if it's a trait possessed by a minority of people, you might call it unnatural. But if that's your sense of unnatural, you can't really equate it with morality or immorality, because it would make being tall or being left-handed immoral. So that doesn't seem right. Another interpretation of unnatural has been, if it has a certain function and it doesn't fulfill that function, then it's unnatural or operating unnaturally. So, if your kidneys or your heart aren't fulfilling their functions of cleaning and pumping blood, then we might say they're abnormal or diseased or functioning unnaturally. So this, approach may be familiar to people that are against homosexuality. They might claim, well, the natural function of sex is to produce children, and then if homosexual sex does not produce children, then it's unnatural, it's not fulfilling its function, and therefore it's wrong. Right? Of course, the problem with this argument is that there's lots of forms of heterosexual sex that don't produce children. Sex after menopause, you're pregnant, and so on. So it seems like you would have to say all of that is wrong too, and I don't think most people would say that. At any rate, it's the fundamental premise is hard to actually defend, right? If you say it's wrong to use anything for other than its natural function, it's a little crazy, right? What's the function of a hand? I guess to grab things. So does that mean it's immoral to wave? Right? I don't know. These are the sorts of arguments and reasons people have tried to give for why homosexuality is wrong, and they don't really seem to work that well. But the point is, what are they doing? They're engaging in a rational enterprise, right? Logical argument, right? So it seems, if you watch the behavior of people when they're talking about morality, they seem to be treating it as an objective enterprise form of like logic or mathematics, not as just an expression of feelings. Because if morality was just an expression of my feeling, I wouldn't need to give you all these reasons, right? You can ask me, why do you think homosexuality is wrong? And you could just say, I don't like it, right? That doesn't seem to be what people do. It doesn't seem to be what people believe. Morality is more objective than that. Now, other reasons people have given about homosexuality is they'll say, well, the Bible forbids it. Then you have to get into all sorts of, further reasoning, like why should we think that the Bible is a good guide to morality? And it's hard to say. The Bible says a lot of things, right? It says you shouldn't eat sheep's fat. It says women shouldn't be in church after they have a child. You shouldn't see your uncle naked. The death penalty for cursing your parents. The Bible seems to allow for slavery in some places. So it's tough. Interpreting the Bible is tricky. Maybe you can find a way where, it turns out slavery is wrong, but homosexuality is also wrong, and according to biblical interpretation. It's a tricky enterprise, and you can spend your whole life. If that's what you want to do, feel free, right? And finally, Pence's argument against homosexuality seemed to he thought it would destroy our society by undermining traditional life. That claim doesn't seem to be either, right? Gay people often seem to be in marrying and raising children, and the outcomes for children of gay parents seem to be quite good. I've seen statistics. There was one study that found literally zero child abuse in homes with lesbian parents, right? So again, the point being, right, and the point of this chapter, we're only using homosexuality as an example. I'm happy to talk about to debate it if you like, right? But the point is not necessarily to debate this applied ethical issue of whether homosexuality is right or wrong. The point is to show that even though people have differences of opinion and make different moral judgments on this issue, that doesn't necessarily entail that it's purely subjective. In fact, if we look at the way people behave, it seems to suggest that they think there is some objective truth there because they're trying to use reasons. So it seems like an objective enterprise, perhaps in the way mathematics or logic is. So Rachel seems to be not in favor of subjectivism. That doesn't mean you have to agree with Rachel's, right? You could, in your paper, argue for subjectivism. You don't need to deal with the issue of homosexuality. Again, that was just an example that was sort of a guiding example to frame the chapter, the subject. But at any rate, Rachel's wants to sort of clear away these subjectivist, relativist views at the beginning, or at least give you reason to doubt them, so that we can now explore some theories of ethics that treat ethics as an objective, where there is a single answer to what